if Winston Churchill hadn't stood up to the Germans, who knows what we would be doing today. I certainly probably wouldn't be talking to you about a Battle of Britain watch, that's for sure. There's this pluckiness about what happened at the Battle of Britain. Here we were, alone at that time. The Americans were still 2 years away from coming into the Second World War. So the last line of defence to prevent us being overtaken and overrun by the Germans was the RAF. Most people remember the speech that Churchill made about the Battle of Britain. Never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. The many, I think in Churchill's head, was not just the British nation, although it was the British nation. I think he meant the world in actual fact.
It was down to so few men. It was what they called the few who stopped it, and they had to, and it must have been horrific. A lot of these guys are really young chaps, 20, 21, that sort of thing, fighting for their lives, flying sometimes 4 or 5 sorties by flights a day, nearly always outnumbered by the Germans. There were two primary fighters during that time. There was the Hurricane, and there were more Hurricanes around than Spitfires. The other one was the Spitfire. The Spitfire is much more famous because it just looked nicer. It was a newer generation of aeroplane. So the Spitfire has become synonymous with the Battle of Britain, with winning the Battle of Britain more than the Hurricane.
Whilst most people will know of the Spitfire itself, not many people will actually be that familiar with the instrumentation that was inside of the cockpit. The clock, the aviator's clock that was in there, was a Smith's Mark IIA clock, and we've taken that as the basis and the inspiration for us to design and move forward with this watch. In terms of the case, it's black, and that is because the Smith's IIA clock itself was black in the cockpit, and that was really a design feature in those days to reduce the amount of reflection, especially flying at night. The diamond-shaped crown, slightly oversized, was a crown that was used by pilots because flying at altitude was very, very cold, very difficult for pilots to wind their watches on. So when they were wearing gloves, it was always easy to have a much bigger crown. So we've kept the C8 crown that we use across all our aviation range in this watch.
You have a design of watch that reflects what was going on inside the cockpit. Then you have a piece of the cockpit embedded in the backplate, all assembled into a watch that is powered by, in many ways, our version of the Merlin engine, if you will, the Caliber SH21. And the fact that there will only be 75 ever made makes this an object of desire for, I think, quite a lot of people.
P7350 was built in August 1940 during the height of the Battle of Britain. It was actually one of the very first to be built at Supermarine Shadow Factory at Castle Bromwich. I think it was the 14th Spitfire, many thousands that ended up being built there.
So it was one of the very first to engage in the Battle of Britain. It joined its squadron, 266 Squadron, in the July of that year, so it was one of the first to engage in the battle. And today remains the last airworthy Spitfire that fought in the Battle of Britain. So we have an incredibly special Spitfire here.
When they restored P7350, the main spars were taken out, which are big, strong pieces of aluminium or duralumin, but also some of the skinning. Some of the panels, I have a small one here, were removed. There are ones again which have a degree of corrosion, and also over time it becomes less flexible, so it can crack. So some, not all, only a relatively small percentage, but some of the skinning, this panelling, was removed. And it's that actually Christopher Ward is cutting the discs from to go in the backs of the watches. But it's original 1940 skinning, and therefore incredibly rare, because very, very few aeroplanes now fly which are original Battle of Britain aeroplanes.
And we're so fortunate to have a piece of metal from the cockpit of that Spitfire. So this is a remarkable watch in its own right, and that it represents such an important moment in the history of this country, but also the history of the world, makes it a very desirable object, and an important object, I think.